The algorithm is a relentless black hole, so I'm going to read you a story I could have given more thought to. Hi, this is Half-Baked Tales, where I write and read one halfway thought-through short story every week. They're not always good, and that is the point. Last week, I read you a second draft of my absurdist story, I'm Down Here, in which our protagonist is feeling left out as there is a party raging in her loft, but she is not invited. Go back and listen to last week's podcast if you missed it. We are 3 for 3 on second drafts, because I'm back at it this week with a new version of a previous half-baked tale. Full-on fantasy with heroes, adventures, and a little magic. Agatha, an old woman living isolated in a fantastical land, is forced into a quest she has avoided for years when a long-anticipated traveler barges through her door. Let's see how she handles it. Here's Half-Baked Tale number 39, The Legacy's Keeper. The front door of Agatha's tiny, isolated cottage swung suddenly open. Her yellow lantern, which hangs handedly at the entrance, was knocked off its nail. The intruder was cloaked against the rain, a weapon at his hip. A simple traveler, potentially a thief, maybe both. His entrance had made Agatha shriek and nearly turned her worried. She hadn't been expecting anyone today. But travelers on heroes' quests were as common a sight in this parcel of the land as any nefarious character was. As quickly as he barged in, he closed the door again, blocking the tundra of barking wind and rain. He wiped his muddy boots on the doormat, righted the lantern to its place, and that was enough to convince Agatha he was not there to plunder. A bright smile broke across Agatha's face, and she shifted into hostess mode. Gesturing for the traveler to recover by the fire, Agatha carefully folded the clothing she'd been mending and shuffled away to brew a pot of tea, patting her chest to soothe her elevated heart rate. Her old heart had been slowing down recently as her body became accustomed to a sedentary lifestyle tending her sewing. On her way to the kettle, she delicately detangled the excess thread from her needle and drove it into a large pincushion set on a side table. Her needle was its lone inhabitant, dug quite ceremoniously into the only puncture right at the top, like a sword stuck in its stone. She stretched her aching back to reach a jar containing her best tea leaves, reserved for occasions such as this, when weary travelers poured through her doorway with their grand tales and good company. That promised treat made worthwhile Agatha's long life in this cabin, isolated, as it was, in the darkest hills this land knows, as far north as you can go and ravaged by terrible weather and even more terrible monsters. People don't visit unless there's great cause, great danger, or great treasure to be found. The comfy armchair squeaked as Agatha drew it out from the corner. She patted it as she inhaled her steaming brew. But the traveler hadn't yet removed his cloak. He'd accepted her hospitality, had dried himself by the fire, but his boots remained strapped and his hood was drawn as though prepared to leave. He had been standing there, watching her go about her business, patiently awaiting her attention for something from her.
Look at you. You must be exhausted. Sit.
Agatha coaxed as she shifted around in her seat, her bright smile flickering on and off. The traveler's wide, warm eyes appraised the armchair she'd reserved for him, but decidedly his jaw clenched, his arms pinned themselves to his sides, and those warm eyes fell back on Agatha. He seemed to her like he was caught between boy and manhood. A stubble on his chin confirmed he'd passed the point of adolescence, but she had a feeling that without the strict restraint on his muscles, he would succumb to cozy comforts like a small child.
"What's your name, dear?"
she prompted, her voice soft and lulling. He took a deep breath before answering. "My name is Theo." His tone of voice was sure and steady. Theo did not ask for Agatha's name in return, but instead allowed his eyes to momentarily wander away from her. He took in the entirety of the cottage, the single small room crammed with chairs, a table, stove, a fire, and a door leading off to an even smaller bedroom. His eyes lingered on a sword displayed on the wall above Agatha's head before returning to her. He was still expecting something, and that something seemed to be coming, supposedly, from her. This is not at all what Agatha expected from one of her visitors. Her usual travelers would collapse into her squashy furniture, graciously indulging in the pretense of home she offered them. They'd always come from so far away, and hers was the only place they could snuggle up and pretend, just for a moment, that their deeds were complete, their quest accomplished, and a quiet life post-successful adventure was right around the corner. This reprieve provided them the strength they needed to complete the last leg of their journey. It reminded them of what they were fighting for. They usually hardly saw Agatha, hardly looked at her, being too lost in memories of monsters they've slain and too excited for a soft bed to ease their aching bones. They stumble in as drunkards seeking a fix, glazed eyes passing over any detail of Agatha other than the image of a welcoming, harmless old woman with an open ear for tales of their bravery. But Theo, standing expectantly before her, had a different look in his eyes. He was truly seeing her, soaking in every detail. The sparse strands of dark brown nearly consumed by her mop of gray hair, her green and brown specked eyes currently unobstructed by the glasses hanging around her neck, but surrounded by lines which documented every smile to have crossed her face. Her black dress and robe stitched and restitched over the years to keep them alive and comfortable for her constantly aging body. All these details have passed over every other visitor's head, as Agatha always preferred it. Her questing died when her husband did. She had no desire to be caught up in the throes of adventures and was content blending into the background of a multitude of other heroes' tales. But there, in Theo's eyes, was the unmistakable look of a quest yearning to snatch her up. Theo did not break eye contact as he lowered to his knees, one hand resting ceremoniously on the sword at his hip. "Agatha, the worthy," he declared, and Agatha shrank at the reverent pronunciation of her long-forgotten title. "The sword and shield, tender of heroes, comforter of the lost, companion of Harold the Great, keeper of his legacy. I have traveled far and wide to complete the quest to end all quests, the fated journey to finish what your brave husband began. I stand before you, asking for the last piece I require, the very piece Harold, your beloved, left behind for me." She who had been sedentary and content all these years, happy in the purgatory her husband's dictated task left her in, was finally called into action, the one singular action she had ached not to take. There is a silence before the turning point of a quest, a pregnant moment holding all the anticipation and sacrifice the hero has trudged through along their arduous journey, the beautiful beat before their hard work pays off. Agatha, all too familiar with the sensation, felt it begin, felt it was seeping off this unwanted visitor, reaching out its fingers to grasp her. She resisted its pull. She pushed back her chair and moved away, shaking her head as though to throw off this reality and find herself instead in a better one. The corners of Theo's mouth pulled downwards and his body slackened. He watched her every move, feeling as though he was peeking in on a secret moment, keeping very still to not spook the legendary hero he was lucky enough to share a room with. A pot bubbling with the dinner Agatha had been cooking called to her, and she began to stir, her back turned to Theo, sifting through the mix of potatoes and carrots. She haphazardly brought a spoonful to her lips, and the scalding meal burned her. For the second time this night, she shrieked, and the spoon clattered to the floor, spreading a mess of chunks around her kitchen. Agatha was frozen. She wanted to rage at the spoon, but found her throat dry and a wetness threatening to overwhelm her eyes. Theo blinked a few times, and a soft, sad smile spread across his face. He pushed himself off the floor and began to edge around the tightly packed furniture towards Agatha and the mess. His cloak was bulky and snagged on the table, so he tossed it off to avoid mistakenly knocking anything over. Underneath, he was a lanky young man, not a hero teeming with muscle or hardened by experience. Even his sword, which he placed to the side along with his cloak, looked 2 sizes too big. Without them, he was agile and helpful. He tapped Agatha lightly on her elbow when he reached her side, alerting her to his presence and asking silent permission to help. Theo grabbed a cloth to mop up all the mess, taking care not to miss any that had splashed on nearby furniture or walls. Agatha did not move, but hovered over him, watching him work just like she had watched the other visitors relax. When finished, he placed the wayward spoon back where he'd seen Agatha take it. Agatha directed her gaze anywhere but his face. The yearning quest was still there, hanging in the air between them, waiting for her to take up the helm. Determined to ignore it, she cast her gaze up at the ceiling like a petulant child. Theo scratched his nose, his eyes shifting around the room, till they landed on the 2 cups of tea. They were still steaming and looked perfectly delicious. Theo moved with a grace that made Agatha grind her teeth. Though she tried to ignore him, her attention was continuously drawn back to him. He pulled out a chair for her, patting it as she had for him, and stood behind it with a pleading smile. With a huff, she resigned herself to sitting. Theo took the adjacent chair for himself and pushed a cup towards her. The delicious aroma eased the crease that had formed between her eyes. He took a gracious sniff and sip of his own, then waited to listen for what she had to say. Agatha told him everything. The words, once released, flowed out of her mouth as easily as a stream. She told him of her days as an adventurer, her mighty sword and mightier conquests, the heights she'd reached and the lows she'd stooped to. She told him how she once saw the whole of the world spread out before her and couldn't perceive its end. Then she told him of Harold, the legendary hero she'd rescued from an embarrassing plunder with an animal trap. How he'd been nothing like she'd expected, and so much more. She told Theo that Harold's fights and wins were exaggerated as they passed mouth to mouth throughout the land, but it was his deeds and the size of his heart that were heroic. Harold was not mighty. He was true to the bone. Her sword may have stood between his death many times, but it was his purity that was the undefeated force that drove evil from the land. Any careful control Theo had maintained on his posture and face slackened as Agatha spoke. He followed each curve of the narrative she wove diligently, afraid to miss any detail. There wasn't a person in the world that knew the legendary hero Harold as well as Agatha the Worthy did. Puzzle pieces of every bit of Harold's story, which Theo had soaked in since he was a tiny child, flew through his mind. They repositioned themselves as Agatha filled in the gaps, forming an entirely new picture of Harold. His heart felt full to burst. Agatha explained that it was Harold's purity that gave him grace enough to realize he couldn't finish his grand quest on his own, that a different hero in a time yet to come would need to take up his mantle. At this, Agatha's eyes flashed to Theo, whose cheeks blushed pink in return. When he had this realization, Harold had asked Agatha to settle down with him, to wait for this hero, and she did. Their years together were unlike anything her adventurous spirit had ever thought she'd want. They'd filled her with a happiness she treasures now more than anything. Agatha's breath hitched. Her head felt light and fuzzy, but she continued to speak. When it was time for Harold to move on from this world, he entrusted her with one last quest, to continue living alone as they had been, to be the beacon for wayward adventurers, and to wait for the last and most important adventurer to arrive, the one who would come seeking Harold's legacy and finally finish his quest for goodness in the land. Agatha was silent for a moment, her fingers pressing into the hot mug. She stood with all the strength her withered body could remember and walked to the table where her pincushion sat. The solitary needle protruding from its top glinted as though sunlight were bouncing off it, though the sky had been dark for hours. Theo's head cocked sideways as he examined its unearthly glow from his seat. Agatha caught his expression and nodded her head thoughtfully. Her story was not yet finished. Hands placed on either side of the pincushion, she continued.
Harold's death was befitting for a hero of his stature,
she said, and described how the wind had blown open the windows of their bedroom, how Harold lay there smiling while it whipped around him. He had looked into her eyes with a brilliant smile as the wind turned him slowly to dust, his body disappearing bit by bit. Agatha had watched as the particles of her beloved had gathered into a perfect small pile where he once lay and then solidified into a long, pointed needle. Agatha plucked the needle from its cushion. It glowed between her fingers like fire.
Harold himself is the last bit you need, she said. I have been holding on to him for so long.
She pulled her focus away from the needle and onto Theo. Making no move to approach him, she braced her once strong legs against the floor, as she would have when faced with a terrible danger on one of her adventures. The same pose she used when confronted with a foe she knew she couldn't best, but Agatha had never turned away from a fight. Would Theo lunge for the beloved last bit of her husband, wrangle it from her for the sake of glory? She wouldn't be able to stop him if he did. Theo's eyes were large and round, his mouth slightly agape, full of awe at this legendary hero's tale of devotion. His momentary interest in the needle's glow had faded. He had only eyes for Agatha, for the legendary hero who had accepted him into the last quest of her life. If he noticed Agatha's confrontational stance, he did not respond to it. So much of him had relaxed since he came blundering into Agatha's home. So much facade had slipped, and he sat there finally as himself. He looked so small to her, so innocent, and so like Harold. Agatha let out the breath she'd been holding since he declared his identity, carefully closed the distance between them, and placed the item of her love into his hands. That was Half-Baked Tale number 39, The Legacy's Keeper. Draft 1 of this story was posted not long ago at all. Its first draft was Half-Baked Tale number 33. It was based on a dream I had had that week in which an old woman was asked to give up a needle containing the soul of her dead husband. I love when muses visit at night. It makes dreaming so very interesting. I know there's a ton of variations on the manner in which people dream. Some are vivid, lucid, very simple, filled with mundane everyday things, or some people don't remember their dreams at all. I'm incredibly lucky that I get a whole TV show at night. Plus, it sometimes makes coming up with story ideas very easy. I spoke last week about my approach to second drafts, how I start pulling at story threads and see how they unravel. Well, a lot unraveled when I began editing The Legacy's Keeper. If you listen to Half-Baked Tale number 33, you'll see that the character Theo is entirely different, mostly in that he is now a whole character with actual opinions. Imagine that. For the first draft, I was all focused on Agatha and her needle. The intruding traveler was really just a means to an end. He was the circumstance intruding on Agatha's life that made it time to tell the story of Harold and the needle. So naturally, the first narrative thread that needed pulling was the traveler as a character at all. How can his responses and his personality and his presence support Agatha's story? How does he relate to Howard? Is Agatha behaving the way that Theo, the traveler, would have anticipated? I don't normally get to flesh out two characters in this series. The weekly structure sets me up to develop one character's journey through a very short narrative. The times where I have had two characters in one of the half-baked tales, it's usually broken up into two separate parts, so I have a week writing time per character. So spending this week developing Theo alongside Agatha felt like an exciting learning opportunity. Personalities don't exist in isolation. They're brought out by a person or character's surroundings, and especially by the people they interact with. As a surprise to no one, this week I've learned the power of complex characterization. So much media has impacted the legacy's keeper. I grounded it in a standard Tolkien-esque fantastical world, which is recognizable to most, at least most people in the West. Heroes adventuring on quests to defeat evil. It's Lord of the Rings, it's Zelda, it's Narnia, Earthsea, The Princess Bride, I could go on. It's in a fairy tale world. But the one media source I kept coming back to, which also was built on this standard fantasy outline, is the anime Frieren Beyond Journey's End. Frieren is set in a Middle-earth type world filled with elves, mages, warriors, heroes, and demons who adventure across the land, completing quests for goodness or glory. It feels so Lord of the Rings in a cozy Hobbit sort of way, but it expands from that fantastical world starting point and develops its own lore and moralities, making it so unique while still recognizable. That's what I kept revisiting as I made edits and expanded on this and that in Theo and Agatha's interactions. What's unique yet still recognizable? It's so interesting when a creator can identify a concept commonly understood by their audience, like fairy tale worlds, and use it as a jumping off point in their own narrative. That's a trust in media literacy and a trust in audience that I am still developing, but I'm getting there. If you enjoy these stories and my chat, please like, comment, follow, or review on whatever platform you listen on. Half-Baked Tales is currently available on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And in this early stage, the goal is to reach new people and find my audience. Engaging with the podcast helps other people see it, but better than manipulating the algorithm is word-of-mouth recommendation. If you know someone who loves a short story, needs to do some more reading, or just loves a bit of casual imagination, send them my way. As ever, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week.